the members of the climate leadership team that came up with the recommendations that are currently being deliberated. So I'm just going to give a little bit of context on those to start things off. So just to start, in terms of the mandate that team was given last April when they were appointed, or when we were appointed, three sort of main ones were to give the province recommendations that helped it achieve its climate targets, help it maintain a strong economy, and mitigate the impacts on vulnerable populations. So on balance, like we're not going to dive into the full package of recommendations here today, but I think the package does a pretty good job of pursuing those or achieving those the three pieces of the mandate. On the climate targets piece, I think unfortunately the recommendations we produced don't get to the province's 2020 target. They put the province on track for a newly recommended 2030 target and on track for the 2050 target. I think the reality is with the stall and climate action that the province has seen over the last 4 years, catching up for that proved to be impossible, so we couldn't come up with recommendations to close that gap in the near term, unfortunately. In terms of the economic piece, the economic results from the package are quite encouraging. So basically sort of looking at the no new climate policy world is having 2.11% annual growth in GDP, and with the package of climate leadership team recommendations, that drops very slightly to 2.07% annual growth. So pretty much a rounding error and lots of uncertainty in those models. I think to me it's a pretty strong statement that the economy can continue to grow, and particularly if you look at some of the costs of climate change we're facing if we don't address the problem, it's a pretty good bargain. And then the last one on the mitigating impacts on vulnerable populations. We'll talk about this a little bit because it's part of the fiscal package, fiscal policy recommendations, but there are measures there to increase protection for, in particular, low-income households around the province, which was built into the first phase of the carbon tax, and the recommendation was to continue and scale that up. Just to sort of quickly summarize the recommendations, and this is what I'll turn it over to Jeff and Brendan to talk with some of their perspectives on them, in particular around the carbon tax. So the first piece in there was to restart increases in the carbon tax. And again, instead of the $5 per ton per year, which was for the first phase, to increase that to $10 per ton per year. The second piece was to expand the coverage of the carbon tax. So right now the carbon tax applies to basically all the fossil fuel combustion in the province. It doesn't cover non-combustion sources, so methane that leaks from the natural gas sector or some of the industrial process emissions in the province. So right now about 70% of the province's emissions are covered, and this recommendation was aimed at closing that gap for the remaining 30%. So the big question when you're looking at sort of an increased carbon tax is, what do you do with the revenue? So the team did wrestle with this and came up with a sort of a package of recommendations to address this. So the first was to reduce the PST sort of across the board from 7% to 6%. As I already mentioned, increase protection for low-income households and northern rural households around the province. The third is, it's a new piece, and I think still sort of an emerging piece of the conversation, was to establish targeted measures to protect emissions-intensive trade-exposed sectors. And so in a world if BC is moving ahead on climate policy and some of our competitors are not, especially as you get up into sort of higher carbon prices, there is a risk of a competitive disadvantage. And that was something the team did not want to see economic activity moving from BC elsewhere because of climate policy. So the idea being that it shouldn't be an exemption for those sectors, but if there is a competitive disadvantage, while that exists, looking at measures, whether that's a program like the province currently has for the cement sector to help it transition to clean energy sources, for example, but wanting to avoid a situation where there was a competitive disadvantage because of that climate policy. And then the last, again, this would be new, the carbon tax to date has been revenue neutral, so all the revenue has gone to tax cuts and tax credits. There's a recommendation that part of the revenue should also be used both to facilitate investments into technology and innovation, and also provide local governments with funding for projects that help to reduce emissions. So just no additional information here, but just sort of to sum up the timing and sort of how things would unfold. So 2015 in early November and of October, the team's recommendations were provided to government. The first recommendation from the team was to make these decisions and announce them in 2016. So I guess the province has said they'll be finalizing their climate leadership plan this spring. So from a Pembina perspective, and I think from the team's perspective, we'd certainly be looking to see determination on those recommendations as part of that plan. The next window there would be 2018, July 2018, when the new schedule of carbon tax increases would start. And then in 2021, somewhat phased in, would be the expansion of the carbon tax coverage. And then finally in 2023 would be the first of what were recommended as a rolling five-year sequence of reviews on the carbon tax specifically, testing whether or not the scheduled rate increases are working appropriately, some of the measures on the economic or equity side are working appropriately, all those sort of questions that are going to come up as the policy moves into its second phase. So where it would be at that point, so you'd have higher coverage than it currently has. In 2023, you'd have a rate of $80 per ton. So in the context of what does it mean in terms of cents per liter, that would be about 18 cents a liter on gasoline. So it's not a huge amount. It's a pretty important amount though, and it does start to sort of shift the economics of a number of sort of technology and opportunities that aren't quite economic today at $30 a ton, but as you move up that, move a bit higher in the price, things start to make more economic sense and become more affordable. So from there, that's all I was going to cover. Look forward to the Q&A as well.
Great, thanks, Matt. So now I'm going to turn it over to Brendan.
Okay, thanks Karen, thanks Matt and Jeff. It's a real pleasure to share some thoughts on the carbon tax from a local government perspective. So Karen, I guess you're just pulling it up now and you'll be driving the ship.
Yeah, it takes a couple people to drive the ship over here apparently. Okay. There we go.
Well, thanks again. So maybe if we can proceed to the next slide. I wanted to start by providing a very brief overview of BC local government's climate action. So for those that are unaware, there's been quite a substantial growth in this file in the past about 8 years. And to a significant degree, this stems from the 2008 BC Climate Action Plan and the associated Green Communities legislation, which required targets, policies, and actions in local government's official community plans to reduce emissions. And also the BC Climate Action Charter, which was started about that time. Currently 180 out of 188 BC municipalities have signed and thereby committed to pursuing compact and complete communities, to inventorying our emissions, and pursuing carbon neutral corporate operations, so our own civic operations. And subsequent to this, we've seen quite substantially increased capacity and focus on climate at the local government level. So across BC, we now have over 50 communities that have developed detailed community energy and emissions plans, which outline strategies to reduce emissions. We've got greater staffing and budget for climate action. You know, for example, 8 years ago, I think it was just one municipality had a community energy manager, and now there's 20 community energy managers operating in multiple local governments across the province. So if we could continue to the next slide, in Richmond, we have targets to reduce emissions from buildings, transportation, and waste, and these are aligned with the provincial greenhouse gas emissions targets. And we adopted our Community Energy and Emissions Plan, our CEEP, in 2014. If you go to the next slide, what this shows, this diagram presents modeling from our CEEP, and it shows how emissions reductions can be achieved over time. So the red line shows our historic emissions trajectory. The first wedge, number one, represents the emissions reductions that we foresee would be achieved through existing federal and provincial policies. So things like vehicle fuel efficiency, the low carbon fuel standard, the building code. The second wedge is actions in our community energy and emissions plan that the city is in the process of implementing. So these include good land use planning, aggressively supporting walkable and transit accessible communities, district energy systems, which Richmond is among the leaders in BC on securing better performance from new developments at rezoning. all those different efforts that we're currently engaged in, we project could lead to a 25% emissions reductions below 2007 levels by 2050. So that would be a real accomplishment, but it's still not at the level that we know is necessary and that our targets and others are geared towards. And so that's where this third wedge comes in. To reach our target, we're going to need all new buildings built after 2025 to be zero carbon. We'll need deep energy retrofits to pretty much all existing buildings and widespread near universal adoption of zero emissions vehicles. And we've been working actively with other levels of government, with utilities, the development industry, with energy service providers, exploring how to get these so-called big breakthroughs to happen. And the bottom line is that there's technically viable solutions to all these problems, but they won't achieve mass market uptake unless, among other things, there's a price on carbon that accurately reflects the negative damage that it does to our environment and our society. And many other jurisdictions and researchers around the world have done similar sorts of studies and found similar things regarding the importance of carbon pricing and other types of policies. So if we go to the next slide, informed by our CEEP analysis, the city provided comment on the climate leadership plan that the province is developing. Our comment noted that the carbon tax should increase or other carbon pricing mechanisms should be introduced to reflect the social cost of carbon. We recognize carbon pricing as probably the single most important thing that the province can do. That being said, there's other barriers besides the price of carbon to emissions reductions. So we also asked for a strategy to achieve zero emissions new buildings and the BC Building Code, to achieve widespread deep energy retrofits. We supported a zero emissions vehicle policy that would require progressively more vehicles sold in the province to be zero emissions, as well as continued to advocate for funding to implement Metro Vancouver's, the Mayor's Council's transportation plan for Metro Vancouver. Let's go to the next slide. We also were requesting ongoing provincial funding support to support expansion of district energy systems using renewable energy, zero waste strategies, and a renewed provincial commitment to protecting agricultural and natural lands and managing them to enhance carbon sequestration while still supporting other values. So that's a very high-level overview of the types of things we were asking the province. The bottom line is that the City of Richmond feels the carbon tax can't achieve the provincial targets alone, but that it's probably the most important component to reaching those targets. Let's go to the next slide. These opinions are shared by many other local governments. There's a BC Mayor's Climate Leadership Council, and they've endorsed the climate leadership team's recommendations, carbon tax and fiscal policies among them. And many other local governments have commented on the climate leadership plan, most endorsing the carbon tax and saying similar sorts of things to what we were asking for. So if you go to my last slide, I'd just like to finish reiterating some of the things that Matt touched upon. This is modeling that the Pembina Institute commissioned based on a proposal from the City of New Westminster to increase the carbon tax $5 a year. So what we see is that this would not get us all the emissions reductions needed, but it would be an impactful step. And as Matt noted, the climate leadership team's $10 a year would have an even greater impact. Net economic activity is not substantially impacted. Jobs and GDP grow at materially the same rate as forecasted. Likewise, to Matt's point, that being said, it does make sense to continue to use a portion of carbon tax revenues to provide credit to northern and rural communities and lower-income populations and others to ensure that those that currently are more carbon intensive or might be impacted more by a carbon tax won't be negatively impacted by the policy. And I think that's certainly reflected in the climate leadership team's recommendations. So I just want to finish by saying these are the same sorts of broad impacts, a real reduction in emissions and negligible net economic impacts that you find in pretty much any serious evaluation of the impact of the carbon price that's been performed for any sort of jurisdiction. So we think we can have confidence that those are the types of impacts that we'd see. So thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Brendan. Now, turn it over to Jeff.
Okay, well, Karen's doing that. I just want to thank Pembina again for hosting this. It's an important seminar, and it's an issue of importance to our members. Karen, maybe go to the next slide. Okay. Just this is just some background on the industry and UDI. We're a significant industry in British Columbia, and we represent at UDI about 650 corporate members, everyone involved in the development industry, from governments all the way to developers and professional associations. Do you want to go to the next slide? So this is the question that was posed to us by several groups, and it's, can we meet the climate leadership team goals and the provincial goals for new building construction? And I think the answer is yes, but a lot of things need to happen quickly. And the critical ones is what I'm going to focus on are incentives, financial mechanisms, and eliminating some of the disincentives that we face. Karen, can you go to the next one? Okay, so here are the incentives that would be ideal from the development industry's perspective in terms of managing our movement into more green buildings. The first one is the most critical one, I think, and it's increasing density. If I can build and sell more, there's a strong financial benefit to do so, and I'm more likely to move much more quickly in terms of building green buildings. There's also benefits to the municipality because density really doesn't cost the municipality anything to implement. There's a political thing, and I'll get into that later on, but in terms of monetary, there's very little. It also contributes to other municipal goals, such as reducing GHGs through compact communities where more people can walk, bike, and take transit and live in smaller and more energy efficient units. GHG reductions also improve public health outcomes. There's less sprawl, so there's more protection of natural and agriculture areas. We're leveraging taxpayer investments in transportation and transit-oriented development areas. We're improving affordability because the units are generally smaller. Now, I just want to emphasize, density does not always work in every situation. Some sites it's not possible, and we do recognize as an industry that local governments face some NIMBY concerns when density is increased. But it's, from our perspective, probably the most important thing municipalities can do. Time is also an important incentive. In our industry, a lot of our members say time is money. And some municipalities have considered introducing fast-track programs for more sustainable projects. And we generally support this, but there are a few issues that need to be addressed because sometimes the savings can be negligible because we find that the innovative designs that people are putting forward for greener buildings actually take more time for municipalities to review, and there's more eyes usually on these projects because municipalities want to ensure that they're getting something for what they're delivering in terms of lower times. So you do have this potential where the projects that are supposed to be benefiting aren't necessarily benefiting a lot, and other projects actually take longer. So one of the things we've looked at potentially we'd like to explore with municipality is having specified timeframes for sustainable projects, or maybe eliminating certain steps such as the design panel, which I'll get into in the disincentive section. There are also financial incentives from utilities. One of the issues that we're all contending with is that if municipalities are allowed to increase sustainability standards in buildings, the utilities are telling us basically that they may have to eliminate some of the financial incentives for that. So that's an issue that we really think needs to be addressed. That regulatory framework the utilities work under, I think, needs to be looked at. We also have to make sure that the paperwork for these programs aren't too daunting. I've heard, some of our members not going into some of these programs because it's just not worth the headache for the benefit that you're getting. There's also been discussions about local governments waiving fees. And the key thing here is to make sure that you don't have a situation where one developer is subsidizing another developer. For example, with development cost charges, people have talked about waiving DCCs or reducing them for green projects. Under provincial rules, this is discouraged unless you can actually demonstrate that the impact on infrastructure for these projects is less. Generally, it would have to come from general revenues, and that's something we would probably want municipalities to look at. There are also recognition and award programs. From our perspective, it's critical that the projects that are picked for these are projects that are cost-effective, profitable, and can be replicated. Otherwise, you're not going to have anyone follow suit with these projects. And then the last bullet on the slide is really a question. I mean, there's been talk about air blower tests or commissioning, and one of the things we'd like to explore with the HPO is whether or not, if this is done, does that actually help us out with the warranty costs that we have to incur? Do you want to go to the next slide, Karen? Now, financial mechanisms are also important, and ideally, these won't cost governments much to implement. They're recommended in the Climate Leadership Team report for current building stock, and we actually think it should be expanded to new construction, especially residential construction where there are no long-term owners of buildings or units. Many talk about life cycle costs and the benefits that incur from more sustainable construction, but these savings are usually long-term. So there's a split incentive problem where the developer and the first buyers don't benefit from these savings. They actually come later on. And ideally, financial mechanisms that spread the incremental cost of green buildings could resolve this split incentive issue to the point where ideally the monthly costs for these projects are lower, as well as the initial cost of buying them. Now, there's a list here in terms of some of the approaches that have been used in the past. One is property assessed clean energy programs out of the states, which the additional costs of implementing sustainability features are spread through property tax bills over time. Now, I understand there were some issues around, who has first rights on the mortgages in the states for the residential projects, but they were used quite successfully on the commercial side. And we do think this is something that should be explored in British Columbia. On-bill financing would involve utilities, and here the additional costs of sustainable construction would be added on and spread over time on your utility bills. Now, I understand there were some pilots that Fortis and Hydro did that weren't successful, but our feeling is that in this case, we'd be looking at stratas and home buyers not having the option. They would actually have to have more energy efficient construction. And the question would really be, do you want to pay that initially or do you want to spread it over 20 years? And we suspect they would want that spread over time. There's green loan financing, which has been a mechanism, when you have a high performance heating system, a strata takes out a mortgage for this enhanced feature and the loan is paid back over 20 years. And again, the savings generated pay off the mortgage. A good example of this is at SFU, there was a project called Verdant, where it was a geothermal and radiant heating system that was installed, and Van City basically offered a mortgage to the strata to pay that over time. There's also leasing arrangements and partnership agreements for sustainability features, where the feature is sort of separated from the project and then leased back to stratas or home buyers. I think that Fortis has also got a similar program where they own a building energy system, maybe a geothermal system, and set it up as a utility. And again, those costs are spread over time. There's a few issues that I think we need to take a look at. How do you determine how much does a window, a high efficiency window, basically actually save energy, or an HRV? Those kinds of questions need to be dealt with. What happens if the energy savings aren't forthcoming? What costs should be borne by the strata corporation? What should be borne by the individual unit holders? Do we need a third party to oversee the process? There's a lot of issues there, but I do think that we need to explore them further. And then, Karen, can you go to the next slide? Now, we'd also like some of the disincentives removed. And the first one's a big one, and it applies both to new construction and existing buildings. If I introduce a green building feature into a project, my property taxes actually increase because the value of the building increases. We've raised this issue with the province, but we didn't really get anywhere with them now. That was before the Climate Leadership Plan review was put into place, and hopefully that's something we can get back to. Another issue is with BC Hydro infrastructure. The way they get developers to fund that infrastructure, it's a bit of a crapshoot. Sometimes basically you have very little cost, other times you have a lot, and it has nothing to do with how much energy your project is going to use. And if they took upon a development cost charges approach, where basically you're charged by how much energy you're going to be using over time, that would actually probably encourage developers to build more energy efficient buildings. Urban design panels and municipal design policies can also be an impediment. Many members had been sent back to the drawing board on their projects because they didn't have enough balconies or enough glazing, which probably is a good thing when it comes to sustainability. These costs add time and delays, and a lot of developers don't want to take the risk, so they basically stick with the status quo. And I really have a question about what's going to happen with the projects of tomorrow when there's expectations of a city of glass in many of our jurisdictions. I think we have to look at our design guidelines so they are more sustainable. And if municipalities set those up and developers are following them, I think they should be able to proceed through design panels. I also think those types of guidelines, if they're improved, would help us dealing with community groups that might be upset with different looking buildings. I think we also have to look at alternative solutions for the building code. Right now, the process can be difficult in some communities, and a lot of the designs we're going to have to come up with are innovative, and how do they get approved more efficiently and quickly? One idea that's been discussed is maybe peer reviews, and I think we would be supportive of that if that would get over that logjam that we're facing there. And I think the big one that we're talking about today is we have low energy and carbon pricing. And I think that basically has been one of the big issues from a buyer perspective. When I talk to our marketing firms, they say sustainability is way down the list, and in part it's because we have such low energy costs. We had a meeting with BC Hydro recently where they bragged that they had one of the lowest rates in North America, which has some of the lowest energy and electricity rates in the world. It's just difficult to get our buyers to be interested in things like, energy efficient stoves and fridges. They're more interested basically in the marble countertops. And I think that's something that we need to look at at least from a consumer perspective. And I think maybe just go to the other slide and I'll just stop there, Karen. The next slide is just some of the other issues that UDI has recommended to get us to the target of achieving some of the building standards.
Great, thank you, Jeff. So we're going to open it up to questions, but before we do that, I think we have a little bit of a webinar break to go to a poll. Oops. So folks who are on their computers, you can take a few moments to answer the poll. And also a reminder that if you have any questions for our panelists, please type them into the question box. Great, so the polling results are in. Do you support increasing BC's carbon tax? 95% of you said yes, and 5% are undecided. I've got a question here for Jeff to get things started. Can you talk or can you provide some clarity on a roadmap for how we get to achieving our target for the province and could you expand on UDI's desire for clarity on the future of buildings, how to reduce energy and emissions from the building sector, what's required?
Okay. Okay, on that one, we've actually been doing a lot of good work with the province, municipalities, Pembina, and other folks with the stretch code discussions. So the province introduced the Building Act, which did restrict what municipalities can do in terms of technical building requirements, but they did set up a working group with a whole bunch of stakeholders to focus on energy efficiency and how to improve it and have a common standard that municipalities could go above and beyond the building code. And from our perspective, that's ideal, especially if that stretch code, basically, we know what the next steps are going to be down the road. Like, in other words, I don't want something where, you know, for the next 3 years, this is what you've got to achieve, and we have no idea what's going to happen after that. So the first thing that we looked at was maybe having 4 tiers so people could see where this stretch code was going to go over the next 10, 20 years. So our folks can actually make investments in terms of, you know, what staff they have to have in place, what kind of designs they need to take a look at. In addition, it's important that that stretch code be linked to the building code. So that, you know, if there's 4 tiers, maybe the first tier basically effectively becomes the base building code when the next iteration of the building code occurs, and then so on and so on and so on. And again, it's critical just to know where we're going. One of the reasons we had the Building Act put in place was municipalities were going in totally different directions, and so the industry did not know where it was going. So we really like the idea of seeing where the future is going to be and what we need to do in terms of design.
Great, thanks. A couple of people are asking a very similar question, and also it's directed to you, Jeff. What price on carbon do you feel would tip the balance for developers in building energy efficient buildings? Or asked a different way, both Matt and Brendan had referenced a $10 a year, $10 per ton per year increase on carbon tax. Do you think that would get us to net zero ready buildings by 2025?
I suspect a couple of points. I suspect it would, especially if it was really advertised and people knew that, you know, this is what the price of carbon was going to be 5, 10, 20, 30 years from now. You know, and that would take a substantial amount of time and energy to educate people. But it's the same kind of roadmap idea. The public knows. I think that would be important. I would just add one thing, though. For us, it's not just the carbon tax. For us, it would be energy costs as well. As I said, BC Hydro was sort of bragging to us about how cheap the hydro is, and that's great. But it's not great when you're trying to sell an energy efficient home. So I would actually even broaden it out beyond the carbon tax and what are we doing with energy costs overall so we can promote energy efficiency. But my suspicion is that, you know, as long as you show what the regulatory environment is going to be over time, not only would you maybe change the behavior of people who are buying homes, but people who are living in existing construction might take really serious looks at, okay, this is what my energy bill is going to be like now. This is what it's going to be like 5, 10 years from now. I better think about doing something with my windows. And maybe there's something we can do with the energy bills or something like that to communicate that type of information.
Great, thanks.
If I can just build on that too, this is Brendan at Richmond here. I think certainly carbon tax will play a big role in building demand for energy efficient and low carbon buildings. We will still need other tools to ensure that those outcomes are achieved. We'll need a building code that specifies those outcomes. We'll need improved compliance regimes for building energy efficiency to get over the other elements that hold back achievement of those types of outcomes, like the fact that there's a split incentive between developers' interests and the ultimate occupant of the building.
And I would 100% agree with that. I mean, it's everything that I had in my presentation, including that last slide. You know, all that has to happen.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. So, Brendan, the City of Richmond, it seems that that goal of 2050 is nearly out of reach based on that current slide with the scenarios. Can you speak to what actions the city is taking to ensure that we can change our trajectory to increase the probability of meeting the 2050 target?
Sure, I'd be happy to address that. Firstly, when Council adopted the target in 2010, it did come with a note that we were committed to taking action at the municipal level, but that it wouldn't be attainable to reach those targets without significant leadership and action from the federal and provincial government levels as well, and from industry and society at large. So not achieving that target is not solely a product of municipal action. There's a lot of other things that need to happen, and that's why we've been so active making comment on the Climate Leadership Plan and participating in other sort of multi-stakeholder processes to try to get some of those big breakthroughs that I mentioned to occur. That being said, we're doing a host of different sorts of activities. We, as I mentioned, are developing district energy systems. So we've got two district energy systems established today, one of which draws ground source heating to a number of developments in our Alexandria neighborhood. The other is in our Oval Village neighborhood, and that'll ultimately use heat from a sewer heat recovery system. And we're exploring district energy powered by renewable energy in other parts of our community as well. So I'd say we're leaders on district energy. We recently, this past year, finished our first year of a Building Energy Challenge, which is a friendly competition to reduce energy use in existing multifamily, commercial, institutional buildings. And we got upwards of, I think, around 8 to 10% of the eligible floor area in our community participating in that, and they reduced emissions by, it was over 10% within a year. Now, part of that was from having a warmer winter last year, but it was still a pretty substantial accomplishment that those buildings in our community made. We're looking at other types of programs we can undertake to encourage greater uptake of sustainable energy technologies in existing buildings. And, you know, the last thing I'll say is our land use planning really is focused on encouraging compact, complete urban villages that'll be able to be served by transit and walking, bikeable communities. So more sustainable community planning is really a core of how we're seeking to develop moving forward.
Great, thank you. I'm also going to get Matt to weigh in on that from a climate leadership team perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Karen. And there's a similar challenge province-wide, and I think there's sort of a neat set of actions there in front of the province in terms of the package presented by the climate leadership team. And I think the language in there is, we thought they'd put the province in reach of the 2050 target and in reach of the new 2030 target we had recommended. They don't actually get all the way. So there's a similar challenge in that. And some of that's, I think, just a limitation of the models we're using. In this case, it was Navius Research was doing the modeling. And I think there was comfort around that table that sort of with new policies for circulation of ideas, that gap could be closed, but it's not sort of it doesn't get us all the way even with a relatively ambitious set of actions. And I think the big challenge facing the province right now is to sort of just shift the trajectory entirely. And right now, like, we do have some good first steps in the province, but the projections are that carbon is going to be going up over the next 10 years. And that's sort of where the climate leadership team modeling landed, where Environment Canada points to BC going. And we need these actions in place just to sort of shift the curve to start going down as a starting point. And hopefully sort of start adding in those additional activities that Brendan is talking about, others are thinking about, that close the gap all the way.
Great, thank you, Matt. Jeff, do you have any evidence that green features are actually showing up in assessed value of a property?
Oh, my property tax chair would probably have information about that. I mean, it's I can explain what basically happens is you introduce a sustainable building feature into the project, How it increases the value is that your costs go down, and therefore your net rents go up. And so the property taxes, especially for commercial and rental buildings, a lot of that is based on what what your net profit is going to be, and that's why it actually goes up. But there was a recognition when we talked to governments about this. I think Saanich actually was looking in on this issue as well. And the issue was it was who was going to provide the subsidy to reduce it. So, I mean, people were certainly aware of that issue in the government, but there wasn't just a clear path in terms of how to address it.
Thanks. This question might be for Matt. What sort of incentives are high emissions trade exposed industries for in exchange for first supporting the carbon tax increases?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I'll put a plug in off of that for next week's webinar. That's the last in our series. We're going to be looking at this issue more specifically. So I think anyways, if you've signed up for this one, it's no problem to sign up for the next one. So we're going to be talking with folks from Ecofiscal Commission and University of Ottawa around that issue specifically. In general, let's see if I can get at this question. So as I said off the top, the idea of this recommendation is it's not intended to be an exemption. So the carbon tax is still paid, and if there is a competitive disadvantage, there's a few principles that were laid out. So one, that any sort of compensation for competitive disadvantage is targeted, so it's specific to a sector and there really is a demonstrable need for it. It's temporary, and that it only be in place while there is that competitive disadvantage. So if it was a situation where there was a disadvantage and our competitor caught up or passed us, that support would no longer be needed. And lastly, that it would be transparent and consistent. So you've got one set of rules you're applying across the economy and not sort of setting up special systems for individual sectors. And the last being that it not undermine the incentive to reduce carbon. So I think that the cement sector program is probably a fairly good example. This was introduced into the budget last year. So they set up the government set up a 5-year program. I think it was $27 or $29 million to help them transition to cleaner energy sources over that time frame. A bad example would be what the province did a couple of years ago with the greenhouse growers. So I think not actually a strong economic case that they were economically challenged, and what the decision was to exempt them from the carbon tax. So it wasn't well justified or particularly transparent, and they resulted in a situation where they were fully exempted. There's a bigger set of possible approaches that could be used to address that meet those principles. The team didn't work through that. Pembina is doing some additional work on that to try to bring some ideas to the province. But anyway, we'll probably touch on that a little bit more in the next webinar, but maybe move on to some other questions for this one.
Thank you. Another question for you, Brendan. Your graph showed that the 2020 goal in the best case scenario would be met in 2025. What elements contribute to not being able to meet the 2020 goal?
I can't, I'm not sure specifically which elements, like which sources most contribute. Basically, there would need to be increased emissions reductions from every sector to meet that 2020 goal. As Matt mentioned, analysis done for the province has said that reaching BC's 2020 goals substantially out of reach. Richmond is a rapidly growing community. That is likely also the case within Richmond.
Great, thanks. Jeff, a couple of questions that I'm going to wrap into one for you around green building and having green features in a building. Can green building be used to market more density at the planning stage? And would you consider parking spaces and add-on garages as part of a green building?
So let's deal with the parking one first. I mean, we've certainly been working with local governments and Metro Vancouver to try and reduce the amount of parking. In fact, Brendan and I had a meeting, it was I think last week, Brendan, where we were talking about Richmond's parking standards. So I think, especially if you're near transit, I think we need to take a look at parking standards. I think Metro had a report where they were saying in some cases we were over parking by almost 30%. That's just a waste of space from our perspective. One of our members talked about for one of his more affordable projects, he couldn't even sell some of the parking spots. He had a few left that he was unable to sell. But I mean, and he had negotiated, by comparison with other developers, pretty dramatic cuts in terms of Richmond's parking standards. So I think there's a long way to go in several parts of the region. But to be frank, we're fighting, or I won't say fighting, but we're talking to a lot of municipalities where the public is driving higher parking standards. And it's difficult, but in many ways that's really being driven by public pressures on council, not by the industry. In terms of the green features, I mean, Karen, I just want to make sure I got the question right, because it's not on my screen. Is that marketing to potential home buyers, or marketing to get your project through?
It's not specified here, but it says it's difficult to market I've heard that it's difficult to market the green features of a building. Can green building be used to market more density at the planning stage? So. Okay,
so in terms of, I'll deal with both. Maybe I'll deal with both. So in terms of marketing to consumers, I mean, we had Rennie at the Rennie group at our School of Development talk about the changes in terms of how the Olympic Village was marketed. And at the beginning of the process, it was all about sustainability and green features. At the end of the process, there wasn't a mention of it at all, because the public, they were not at all interested in it. They did not sell it all as a feature. They were more interested in location, and then the actual look of the units, not how sustainable they were. It's difficult to say if it helps at the public consultation stage, because I think, quite frankly, the public sort of expects that the building should be green anyways, and it's not something that should be necessarily linked to density. Although I would say, I would like to see a few pictures where you show a denser building that's maybe using less energy than the houses that people are coming from. I mean, that would probably help out a bit, but I think there is sort of an expectation that the projects are green, and that is an issue that we're going to have to overcome. And I'm still concerned about the reaction the public may have to the look of these buildings, and I think we're going to have to do a lot of explaining about why buildings are not looking the way they used to in Vancouver.
Great, thank you. We're going to have another poll now. Should the Climate Leadership Team's package of recommendations form the basis of BC's Climate Leadership Plan? So we're interested to know whether the government should implement the full package, the plan should go further, or the plan should not include the full package. Or you haven't made up your mind.
Karen, on this one, I just wanted to say one thing, because we didn't get to this, and I'm going to actually put undecided, because the one issue that I think we were concerned was the lack of focus on land use. There was a comment about it in the Climate Leadership Team report, but I guess when they did the modeling, there was a feeling that linking land use and transportation didn't have that much of an impact, and I would say we would disagree with that, and we'd want to see more of a focus on that. I wasn't quite sure how that modeling came about, but that was an issue from our point of view, because we think that kind of land use interchange with transportation drives a whole bunch of changes. Maybe they're not direct, but certainly indirect.
Great, thanks, and I'm going to get Matt to weigh in as well on that.
Yeah, it's a totally good point, Jeff, and it's probably, in terms of like feedback and questions I've gotten about the Climate Leadership Team recommendations, one of the highest ones in terms of that sort of why isn't sort of land use in there more prominently. I'd agree it is a gap in what's in there, and I'm not sure in terms of the results we produced you could necessarily sort of get emissions down further or faster, but I think because like it's a pretty technology heavy pathway in terms of low carbon fuels and clean vehicles. It does go a long way towards decarbonizing transportation. But I think there's also real risk that some of those technologies on either front don't play out the way they're in the model, and doing a better job on land use so that you're not needing as much transportation gives you some redundancy in that plan. The other benefit of it that was essentially sort of outside the scope of the climate leadership team are all the co-benefits around better land use, so better health outcomes, reduced congestion. There's a bunch of pieces there that are benefits I don't think anyone on the leadership team would have disagreed with, but weren't really part of our core mandate. So because we spent, I think, a lot of our time wrestling with sort of some of the other economic environmental trade-offs, we just didn't get to that. So I agree it's a gap, and I think it's my own sense I don't think you'd find a lot of opposition to, at least the climate leadership team, around doing a better job on that.
Great, thanks, Matt. So the poll results are up. 14% think the government should implement the full package. Almost 60% think the plan should go further. I'd love to know more details about what folks feel should be included. 7% think the plan should not include the full package, and 21% are undecided. Another question here regarding electrical energy use in multi-unit residential buildings and single-family residential. This has the potential to change significantly with electrical vehicle adoption and potentially moving away from gas heating to heat pump technology. Despite the GHG benefits that these energy transfers would entail, there is a cost disincentive that exists due to the two-tier structure of electricity pricing. And this is an open question. Would the panelists consider this two-tier disincentive worthy of attention?
Jeff, I think basically BC Hydro has to take a look at, especially on the electric vehicle side. We have some issues. It's not just on the on what the ratepayers have to pay. That certainly is an issue that needs to be addressed. But we've also found that when you have electric vehicle infrastructure in a project, sometimes it can push you over on the capital side, so you have to build. The developers all of a sudden now responsible for even more electrical infrastructure outside. So we've certainly been encouraging BC Hydro to address that issue. So there's certainly the two-tier rate structure, and I totally agree with that. But there's also a disincentive on the capital side.
And I would just say that, pretty much any assessment of how we get to a lower carbon universe involves a certain degree of electrification, so electrification of vehicles, electrification of some household and commercial building technologies that are currently served by gas. So definitely it makes sense for Hydro to have the mandate to continue to explore, and the BC Utilities Commission, how rates may be penalizing adoption of those more sorts of sustainable technologies. So I think that should be certainly considered and in play.
Yeah, it's Matt here. Just to add one thing in quickly. It's not addressed in the climate leadership team recommendations at all. Interesting idea, something I've given a ton of thought to, but definitely as you sort of push towards, as Brendan said, one of the solutions is going to be more electrification in certain instances, and you don't want sort of rate structures or other pieces sort of working against the direction you're trying to push. Just generally on the structure of the CLT recommendations for both buildings and transportation, they took a structure of, here's a target we think is achievable, and I think they're pretty ambitious targets for those sectors. Here are a few key pieces we think should be in there, and then I think there's a pretty open acknowledgement that it's not a comprehensive list with a full set of strategies, and on Jeff's presentation, there's a whole bunch of other ideas that I think form the basis of what could round out that strategy to something that is more comprehensive and lets you achieve those targets. But they definitely were not intended to be a do these 5 things and you'll get to this target. They were intended to be 5 things we think are important as a group, but recognizing there's a bunch more that has to be done too.
Great, thanks. So before we wrap up, I just want to bring folks' attention to some resources that will help facilitate any interest that you may have to submit your own comments to the Climate Leadership Plan consultation period. I'm going to do a shameless plug right now for a letter that the Pembina Institute initiated with Clean Energy Canada, the Climate Smart Business, and the Board of Change. This is a letter addressed to Premier Clark, basically saying we endorse the Climate Leadership Team's recommendations around the carbon tax and are asking for an increase in the carbon tax in terms of rate and breadth of the tax. So if any of you on the call are representing businesses and are interested in signing on to the letter, it's available on our website. We also have our own submission to the Climate Leadership Plan, the second phase of consultation available on our website, and the Climate Leadership Team's recommendations. A summary of those recommendations is available on our website. I want to thank our guest panelists, Brendan McEwen from the City of Richmond and Jeff Fisher from UDI again for their time. And I want to thank all of you for your interest in joining us today. And again, this website will, this webinar will be available on our website. Thanks again and have a great afternoon.